Yeah, we're live on wherever.
Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the first ever presentation of after the pandemic at COP. Today we've got a number of speakers coming up later on in the afternoon, but first I would like to invite onto stage Jeremy Williams, who's here to talk to us about how climate change is racist. So I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello. Before you get too excited, I do apologize for the lack of Lego in this session. All the fun is going to be had next door. But we'll talk about some more serious things here. That's fine. Yeah, thanks for coming along. I'm aware that in terms of climate-related events per capita, there is probably more happening right now in this city than anywhere else on the planet ever. And so getting anyone to turn up to anything is a bit of an achievement, I think. So thank you all for being here. I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about the book that I've written that came out earlier this year called Climate Change is Racist. Give you a bit of an oversight of kind of what it's about, and then we can talk about it and take questions and see where it takes us from there. So I'm not going to put stuff on the screen. We're going to do it old school. But we don't normally talk about climate change in racial terms. It's not something that's been part of the currency of the environmental movement or debates around climate change. But to tell you a little bit about how I came to see it that way, I grew up in Madagascar and then in Kenya. And we never talked about climate change when I was little. It hadn't really come up. But when I came to university and learned about it for the first time, I could straight away see how there was an injustice to the way climate change played out, in that it was caused by developed countries like Britain, but it was going to affect places like Madagascar much more. And so while all the textbooks and lectures and so on, when we talked about climate change, if it came up at all, it was talked about as an environmental issue. There was clearly this kind of really strong development angle, poverty angle, justice angle to it that I was kind of seeing. I didn't see the climate change, didn't see the racial angle until much later. But when I did, it was when I was looking at two different maps, and I put up a map of countries where carbon footprints are highest, and a map of where countries are most vulnerable to climate change. And I'll show them to you. Hopefully you'll be able to see it from here because the colors are bright enough. So this is the first of those. This is per capita carbon emissions. So quite simply, countries that are in red have very high carbon emissions. countries, the darker the green they are, the lower the carbon footprints that people have in those countries. You can straight away see that there's like this band of very high carbon footprints across the global north and also in Australia, which is part of the global north. Don't ask me why. And very low carbon footprints, particularly across Africa and across Asia and through India, places like that. China, we know, is the world's biggest emitter. It comes out yellow here because it has such a huge population. So when you spread their huge emissions across the world's biggest population, it obviously isn't as bad as many other places. Mongolia, worst place in the world, is not because everyone's like flying in their own private jets, but because they have a small population and a huge amount of coal. So that's why that's there. This is the second map. This is climate vulnerability, which is measured by Notre Dame University in the States. And here we see something quite different. So here the colors are completely reversed. Here in the green, which is all of a sudden across the global north, shows relative safety from climate change, and red, orange to red, shows mounting danger. So again, we see this division here. Lots of countries in the global north that were most responsible for climate change, but are least affected by it. And across the center of the world here, countries that are highly vulnerable to the risk of climate change. If you put the two side by side, which is what I did when I was doing this report, you see they're almost negatives of each other. Like the red and the green swap over between the two. And so what you see there is there's this huge disconnect between the causes of climate change and the effects of climate change. And I think there's several different injustices or inequalities that we can see at work in these images. One is obviously the rich and poor one. These are the richer countries. You naturally have higher carbon footprints in places where people drive and where they fly and where they eat meat, buy lots of stuff. Across sub-Saharan Africa, you have people who often have very little, maybe living on a couple of dollars a day. You're not consuming anywhere near the amount of stuff. You may not even have a reliable electricity supply at all. So carbon footprints are very low. So there's an economic injustice in the way that these people have caused it and these people are going to suffer it without having contributed anything to it. There's also quite a simple geographic divide here that we can see. If you look at the vulnerability to climate change, these countries in the green that aren't very vulnerable are in the temperate regions of the world. So naturally, the prospect of global warming means a lot more if you live in the Middle East or in North Africa than if you live in Sweden or Finland or wherever. So there's a geographic divide here as well. But we can also look at these maps and see a racial divide, because we look at the countries that are most responsible for climate change. What color skin do people have in the global north? We're talking majority fair-skinned people like me. And if we look at the people who are most affected, the dark green countries here that are really at the front lines of climate change, they're people of color. So whether we like it or not, there is a racial dimension to climate change. And that's quite hard to hear for people who are passionate about climate change and also passionate about being anti-racist, and suddenly you realize, hang on a second, these two things are really connected and we really don't talk about that enough. So when I kind of saw that for the first time, which was probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, I didn't understand how that worked. I'd actually never heard anyone say there was a racial dynamic to climate change. I went online, tried to find a book about it and couldn't find one. Not only could I not find a book about climate change and race, I couldn't even find a book on climate change written by a person of color. That has changed, and there's actually several out just this year, which are beginning to widen our perspectives. But if you look at who writes books about climate change, they are by far and away dominated by white men in English-speaking countries, of which I am one, and I'm very aware of that. So as the years went by, I kept looking, is anyone talking about this? I eventually found that lots of people were talking about it, but not in the circles that I moved in. So I just hadn't come across it. In the US, more so than in Europe and in the UK, there's quite a well-developed environmental justice movement. And the reason I hadn't really come across them is because they were more concerned about pollution and local issues than about climate change. But once I kind of found that, I realized there was this whole legacy of thought around environmental racism that translated directly into climate change. And so the book is written basically off the back of that movement and that thinking and decades of good thinking about that. So that's where we come to. The question that a lot of people have straight away, especially when they read the title of the book, is, well, how can climate change be racist? It's something that some people want to sneer at. Oh, everything's racist these days. You get that kind of phrase. But it's important to understand that there's more than one kind of racism. So when we talk about racism, a lot of the time, we're talking about interpersonal racism, the actions and opinions of racists. And we know what that looks like. You know, football fans who want to boo when players take the knee, that kind of thing. That's, in most circles, not really socially acceptable in ways that it used to be. And so, you know, that's kind of less of a problem than it used to be, but still very much there, simmering away in the background. But there are other deeper forms of racism. And the next kind of level up, if you like, once you move beyond interpersonal racism, is institutional racism. And that phrase became more common after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry back in the 90s, where people realized that the police had failed to deal with that murder case efficiently because they were dealing with a Black teenager in London. And the normal processes hadn't been followed. It was quite obvious that as far as the police were concerned, his life had less value and they hadn't followed procedures correctly. And so they realized that even though the police commissioner was desperate to point out that his officers weren't racist, the institution had failed Stephen Lawrence and his family. And we're still, you know, dealing with the consequences of that, particularly in London, decades later. We get the same thing in things like healthcare. I was really shocked to read that in the UK, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. Why is that? It's not because all midwives are racists, it's because there are these deeply embedded structures within society and within the NHS that mean that some people get worse care than others. And so we have this very real problem of institutional racism that's kind of layered on top of personal racism. And then there's a bigger level on top of that, which is when we get to structural racism, which is over and above all these institutions. It's kind of built into history, has deep historical roots. And it's that kind of racism that we're talking about with climate change. So we could, if you want to, I can look at some of the history of how we've ended up there. Because I think it's really interesting that climate change isn't happening in a neutral world. It's happening in a historical context. It's happening in a world where there are all kinds of existing power imbalances, and some of those go back hundreds of years. If I were to show you a map of countries that were colonized in 100 years ago, it would look a lot like the green countries on this map, apart from South America, which was liberated from the Spanish 100 years before, or 200 years before. But certainly in 1920, all of Africa was occupied by Europeans, apart from Liberia and Ethiopia. India and kind of all across the east, right out to the Dutch colonies out here, was all occupied by European powers. And there were no colonies in the global north, apart from like Iceland and Greenland. If we look at who has power at the COP, who's influencing decisions most, it will be those countries that were colonial powers. And the ones who are most vulnerable to climate change are often the countries that were occupied 100 years ago. So there's all these power dynamics that are being dragged into climate change and affecting people along racial lines. Quite difficult to get your head around the fact that slavery and empire and colonialism all feed directly into climate change. But when we look at the kind of decisions that are made about, say, do we go for 1.5 degrees or do we go for 2 degrees of warming? The global leaders will negotiate that. They'll talk about which one is going to be best for the world, and they choose the one which is often best for the global north. The global north doesn't have the same sense of emergency about it, doesn't have the same urgency. It's not living with drought and with famine and very real consequences of climate change. And so you take your foot off the pedal a little bit, you delay, you know, and you choose higher targets that are further away in the future. And the people who pay for that are people of color in the global south. So I think racism has actually already affected the way we address climate change. And it will affect the decisions that are made in the next couple of weeks, just down the road. In terms of what we do about that, it's a really tricky question because this is a problem that's been hundreds of years in the making. Climate change itself unfolds over the course of decades. And so there just are no easy solutions. And that's the difficult bit really of talking about this stuff is there's no like 3 quick things you can do to unravel the influence of colonialism in climate change. But one of the most important things to do is to really focus on the places that are most affected. The fact that there have been so many books written by white people in the global north about climate change, that's something that needs to change. We need to hear a lot more perspectives from elsewhere. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a book written called A Bigger Picture by Vanessa Nakate, who's a climate activist from Uganda. That's basically the only example I can think of recently of a book by an African climate activist. I would all encourage you to read that. A Bigger Picture by Vanessa Nakate. We definitely need more voices like that, bringing a fuller perspective into the debate about what climate change is and how we solve it and how it's affecting people differently. Other things we can do, I think we all know there's this long debate about whether our own actions make any difference or not to climate change. I think knowing that when we take actions like eating less meat or choosing not to fly or those sorts of things, knowing that we can do that as an anti-racist act of solidarity gives it an added power. And it kind of gets over the question of, well, does it make any difference if my neighbor doesn't do that and he drives an SUV or whatever? I'm doing this because it's making a difference to people in other parts of the world. I think that gives it a powerful new dynamic. And then I think the most important thing is just talking about it, not being afraid to have difficult conversations. Racism is a really difficult thing to talk about. It's difficult for white people to talk about in different ways. It triggers defense mechanisms in a lot of white people. So it does make people uncomfortable. It's something that we want to dodge. It's really difficult to think about legacies of colonialism and what kind of responsibility that gives us now. But we have to have those conversations because they're really going to matter, and they're going to matter more and more with each passing year. So I would like to hear what you think about it and what questions you have about this whole topic. I've got a couple of copies of the book if you'd like to read it. They'll be available at the front afterwards. But who's got a question or a comment about any of that kind of stuff? Yes. Mm. Wow.
And obviously most of them are like probably not.
Yeah.
And as well as being this is also a demographic thing here,
Yeah.
the young people are now.
Mm.
So you know we're often here talking about we've got COP, we've got a lot of things about using what we're working, but that kind of cohort decision makers represent actually a really, really small proportion of the global electorate, and countries have played to that. And so what do you think about what that says about the chances of this COP or this whole process getting through?
Yeah, absolutely. So question here is there a demographic deficit in terms of the decision making at places like the COP, given that so many of the attendees are the average age of 60 and white from the global north? And you're absolutely right, there is a demographic deficit there. We know certainly in Africa, you've got very low average ages in some countries. And so you've got older white men making decisions that will affect in a life and death way, the lives of teenagers in Africa, often completely unaware. White men in their 60s are probably the most privileged people who've ever lived. And one of the big problems is that richer countries are so insulated from the effects of climate change, not just because we live in temperate countries that are less affected, but also we have the money to adapt. So if we get summer heat waves and so on, well, then we'll just put air conditioning in. And we've got money to adapt in those ways other places don't. So yes, there is absolutely a real risk that the COP will be dominated by those voices. we don't have to look very far into the history of previous climate conferences to realize that the failings of the COP process are fairly systemic. So whenever it comes around to the climate conference, I always have that kind of mixture of optimism and pessimism, that this is the process we have. So we kind of have to hope for the best out of it, but we know that it doesn't work. And that's why groups like Extinction Rebellion and the school strike movement are not here protesting, demanding things from the COP. They're protesting against the COP. And again, saying this is an illegitimate system that has failed in the past. And I totally understand that. I almost kind of want to stand with them and then go and talk to everyone else. And like, maybe we need both. Maybe we need like a good cop, bad cop kind of thing to keep them honest. But yeah, you're right. And I think it's very difficult to work out how we change that on an international basis. On a national basis, you could do things like have citizens' assemblies, or groups that try to bring in different voices and work out how you address climate change with more of a consensus basis. So it's not just white men making the decisions. But internationally, that's really difficult to know what we do about that.
There's a lot of people in Glasgow talking about a justice reset, like how do we use this COP at this moment with the pandemic for a justice reset and put fairness and equity at the heart of the climate negotiations. I guess so much about it about differentiate responsibility. Well, people who cause the least harm are being impacted the most. How do you get to go about doing that in a system that is already so full?
Yeah, so the question here is how do we go about making a just response to climate change in a system which is already flawed? Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it's on the local level, it's much easier. So we know that there are all kinds of things you can do to lower emissions and respond to climate change that will benefit the richest first. So for example, you could subsidize solar panels. Well, that's great. I took advantage of the government subsidy for solar panels myself a few years ago, but you've got to have the spare money to afford solar panels. And you can only take advantage of that if you own a house. So straight away, you're going to be serving the kind of middle-class homeowners through that. If you were to subsidize, say, public transport, buses in particular, then straight away you're targeting your spending towards people who don't own cars, people who aren't old enough to drive, people who live in cities and who are therefore more likely to suffer from air pollution and things like that. So you always have these choices about how you can spend the money and who's going to benefit. And that's always going to be the most important question, is who does this serve? Who does this spending serve? When we apply that at an international level, one of the really big talking points from the COP this year is around climate finance. And one of the things that developing countries have been saying is all this climate finance to help countries adapt has been promised and then not delivered. So step one, please deliver that money. But the second thing that they're asking for is that a lot of the money that they are receiving is to help them cut emissions. Well, where I grew up in Madagascar, carbon emissions per capita are 0.16 tons per person per year. That's 100 times less than they are in Australia. Why on earth would you give money to Madagascar to help them cut emissions? Like, of course, they need to develop in ways that don't expand their emissions, but they can go up above 0.16 tons per person. So when you give poorer countries money to cut emissions, that's self-serving, because it's the Western countries that are dodging their responsibility to cut their emissions by getting those cuts to happen in other parts of the world. So one of the big demands from developing countries this time is the money that you're putting aside for climate finance, make it available for adaptation and to compensate for the loss and damage of climate change. Don't peg it to cutting emissions. So that's one way that we can do it. Yeah. Yeah, so the question here is, should we be looking at biodiversity and spreading out that financing across those other things? And yes, that you're absolutely right. When we look at where the greatest capacity is to absorb carbon globally, Europe and the UK already cut down our forests hundreds of years ago. We should be replanting them as fast as possible. But tropical forests grow faster anyway. Some of the time they're already there. If those trees are cut down, obviously there's the risk from the land use change that happens there. So supporting countries with extensive forest cover is really important. And of course, like you say, it responds to the biodiversity crisis, which is always playing second fiddle to climate change. And I'm absolutely as guilty as this as anyone else. My brother, who's here with me today, is a conservationist and is always calling me up on that. But the two are completely linked. And when the things that harm the climate and the atmosphere are also the things that harm wildlife. And wildlife also suffer from climate change. There was that horrendous statistic from Australia after the bushfires about a billion animals that were killed in horrendous circumstances by fire and smoke, and 3 billion sort of moved or injured. And I mean, for anyone with just even a modicum of compassion for animals, that's just extraordinary. So we're dealing with animal trauma as well as human trauma when it comes to climate change, and we can tie these things together. Within the UN, I think there are separate conferences for biodiversity, and there is a growing awareness that they do need to be brought together a little bit more. And that will be on the agenda in the next couple of weeks. And we'll see what comes out of it, whether there's any will to tie them closer together. It's why people like Extinction Rebellion keep talking about the climate and biodiversity crisis. And it's a much longer phrase to say, but it is important. Any other questions? Yeah, so for the benefit of the streaming, yes, there's a question about Hurricane Katrina and the local effects and whether there was a racial dynamic to that and whether that has prompted conversation around that. And yes, Hurricane Katrina does feature in the book because all these impacts that I'm talking about globally, where there are racial divides, also apply locally. Not always, but certainly in the States where there's much more racially mixed cities, we see those effects very clearly locally. In all sorts of random things that you wouldn't necessarily expect that are kind of a legacy of American cities being segregated. So you look at things like the average heat during a heat wave in an urban environment, and often it's the majority Black communities that just literally have hotter streets because 50, 60 years ago, they didn't have the same parks and the same urban trees put in that the white communities had because there wasn't the same investment in those communities. And even though segregation is supposed to be long ago in the past, more people are going to suffer from heat waves and your streets are literally hotter. So those injustices get embedded, and we saw that in Katrina as a very clear example, both of the most affected communities, because the richer communities, ergo the white communities, had often protections and seawalls and other flood defenses that Black communities didn't have. But then after the storm, the rebuilding happened again, where people had most power and could shout the loudest to have their homes and streets rebuilt. And if you go to New Orleans today, there are still large neighborhoods that have been never repaired and they have been abandoned. And then if you look at the population of New Orleans, and again, it was 2004, 2006, I can't remember now, a while ago, but those populations have never recovered, and the demographic of New Orleans has shifted. So it's gentrified because all the white community came back, but a lot of the Black families that had to move away, their homes were never rebuilt, so they've resettled somewhere else. So the whole city is now more white than it used to be, and it's more gentrified. So that the local effects can be very real. When I was looking at this, I was looking for research into this kind of stuff in Britain, and I really couldn't find very much. The environmental justice movement isn't as well developed in Britain at all. And it's something I would love to encourage more research in. But you do see some key examples, like, for example, Black residents of London are more exposed to air pollution. And there have been some high profile stories around that in the past. If we go looking, we will find those injustices. They just haven't been studied yet. Yeah.
I think there are other forms of, it's a really fantastic talk. Do you think there are other forms of racism like this? Whether you could argue that there's product racism, or so we're all using these fantastic products that are all made with very low cost labor in China. And similar for, say, the cruise line, because all the boats end up in India.
Yeah.
These, graveyards for boats.
Yeah.
It's sort of, but we don't. Would you talk about the same? Is that similar? Because it does really impact the society.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question here is: are there other racial dynamics and injustices to globalization? And the fact is, there are all over the place. And so you mentioned manufacturing. If we look at where clothes are made, chances are that like 90% of the clothes that we are all wearing in this room were sewed by women of color in a poorer country. Highly skilled labor, which is incredibly poorly rewarded. And that is completely systemic. And it doesn't really matter whether you buy expensive brands or low quality brands, they are almost certainly made by skilled women of color in other countries. Why is that the case? Because we can afford to pay them less. We could not afford a skilled seamstress, let's be honest, in a white country for the same money. But the labor of women of color in places like Bangladesh is literally worth less. And that absolutely is a racist phenomenon. It is structural racism. And again, because we're dealing with structural racism, it's not that, the owner of Topshop or whoever is racist. Some of them will be, but it doesn't need intent there. It's a systemic thing. It's about outcomes. That happens in climate change in different ways as well. So we could look at some of the solutions to climate change. So I was reading recently about plans to put, acres and acres of solar panels in desert regions, places like Mauritania, Namibia, and then create hydrogen out of seawater and then ship the hydrogen to Europe. Well, half the population of Mauritania doesn't have electricity. Can you imagine how it would feel to have like square miles worth of solar panels installed in your country and you're still lighting candles at night? That is a colonial mentality of we will take what we need from this country and the people there, well, they, whatever. And so we still see those things, even in climate solutions, because this is a world where we have a long legacy of injustices and colonial power balances, and that's going to affect all sorts of other things. Where I went to school in Kenya was not far away from Lake Naivasha, which is a very fertile region where loads of flowers and things like mange tout and baby sweet corn and stuff is grown. And you can buy it in Marks and Spencer and places like that. The region of Kenya, which is most fertile and has the best farms, is growing food for Marks and Spencer in Britain and not for people in Kenya. Because that's where you make the money, is by selling to the white people overseas. And again, there's a racial dynamic there that makes me uncomfortable when I start thinking about it, but it never comes up. No one's going to go into Marks and Spencer and say those baby sweet corn are racist, but there's a racial injustice behind them there. And the more you look, the more you see, to be honest. Once you start thinking about structural racism on this global perspective in a globalized world, it is everywhere, and it's something that will take a very long time to root out. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, we'll do.
We have people in 5 minutes. Alan, something like that. Or go get people.